name's Tim Oates. I'm Group Director of Assessment Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment. I've worked on international comparisons of the performance of different education systems and on curriculum theory, assessment theory and so on for many years. And today I'm going to talk about the kind of principles that we've been working on for future assessment. There are many people talking about the way in which education will change as a result of what we've learned during pandemic. And many of those voices are quite opportunistic. They're just kind of introducing things because of the level of disruption, things which in some cases people have been talking about for years but have had no ability to get any traction. In other cases, there are some good insights coming from research about disrupted education, but it's very noisy out there. And we need to understand how to focus on really well-grounded principles for future education in all sorts of spheres, from early years through to compulsory education, adult learning, and areas like learning a second language around the world. So this idea of evidence-driven principles is really important, and we have focused on that at Cambridge Assessment. During the pandemic, we've really heard quite a lot of year zero thinking, that the pandemic causes us to reject everything that we've known about education systems and about approaches to education in the past. I just don't think that's the case at all. We have discovered some things about the resilience of our education systems, the extent to which we've had problems running formal assessments, the kind of practicalities of assessment, the practicalities of learning have been threatened by the processes which pandemic has caused us to put in place. And I want to reflect on that. I'll be using some notes, so I'll be looking down at those. I'll be looking across at my iPad and tapping that. So bear with me in terms of looking in all sorts of places whilst I'm recording. So let's dive into this issue of principles. We've got a lot of accumulated curriculum theory, a lot of accumulated cognitive science about the way that people learn. We've got a lot of experience, all of us around the world, in terms of the practicalities of either getting kids into schools or encouraging adults to engage in learning. We know a lot about improvement, and a lot of that understanding of improvement of education comes from transnational comparisons. It's something we've done a lot at Cambridge. Recently I've compared the PISA results for 2018 from different countries and written that up in a chapter of a book with Nino Crato. There's a lot to learn from these big transnational comparisons. One of the things I really want to focus on is this idea that of course we can harness digital applications and technology to support learning, but we shouldn't suspend what we know about learning from the past, and we must use the kind of evidence which has been emerging during pandemic about digital. We know from the work of people like Beryl Crooks at the Open University that for adult learners trying to re-engage with learning, the support of a professional educator and well-curated materials, both of those are absolutely fundamental. This is not a kind of what we call a solipsistic world, somebody just working in isolation and engaging flexibly with everything around them. There's no evidence that that will work. In fact, there's a great deal of evidence from pandemic that simply relying on people to have intrinsic motivation to engage in learning, that just relying on that is an inappropriate assumption. What we've seen with pandemic and the use of digital devices to open up access to learning is a massive opening of equity gaps. We can't assume that everybody's equally intrinsically motivated to engage in learning, to spend time on it, to grapple with digital devices and access, to get to the heart of learning. They need support, and particularly for young people who are not necessarily intrinsically motivated to learn in demanding subjects. We need to understand how all of the things that we have thought about in terms of education previously should be brought to bear. Now that's what I'll focus on. And you can tell in that what I'm committed to is high attainment and high equity. I mean, all too easily, we could provide facilities remotely for those who are committed to learning to engage in learning. And what we would see is high attainment and overall attainment improving, but big equity gaps opening up. So we've got to guard against that, because we know those equity gaps and those inequalities drive all sorts of problems, not just in education, but in society more widely. So although I know with language learning, we're often talking about adults coming to learn again, often in the language area, because they are extrinsically motivated, because they want to get access to labour markets or to international movement or to participation in economies and economic and social processes. So their motivation is high. We have to just briefly think about, well, what if it isn't? And we need to think about schooling, really, to get a bit of a lens on that. Why do we have schools? Why for hundreds of years have we tried to get young people into schools? It's because many of the things that we want young people to learn are counterintuitive. They're not obvious from the outside world. Theories of the unconscious, the fact that the Earth goes around the sun, many areas of science, electrical current, conservation of mass, they're counterintuitive. It took human civilization many hundreds of years to acquire this knowledge, and it is counterintuitive. It's about deep structures. And I'll come on to that in relationship to language learning in a moment. So they're not obvious from everyday experience. That's why we put kids into schools, because schools are full of programs which represent carefully curated knowledge, and the acquisition of that counterintuitive, powerful knowledge is supported by highly trained, qualified professionals who know how to present this in a way that it can be acquired by all of the young people, not just some. That's why we've striven for hundreds of years to get children into schools. So this kind of year zero thinking, a pandemic has proven that digital can replace schooling. That's terribly, terribly naive. School has a focus on individual learning, but supported through highly trained professionals, and in a context where social learning is possible, where learners are part of a learning community. Now, none of that's changed. That's really optimum for human learning. And so in thinking about principles for future education, we need to think about that. We need to think about the improvement that we have managed to effect internationally around the world. And our principles are really drawn on our evidence, because what we can do to improve education, again, hasn't changed. The kind of things that we have done to bring young people to an understanding of mathematical knowledge, to bring older learners to an understanding of mathematical knowledge, that's all still in place. Our brains haven't changed as a result of the pandemic. The structures of our short-term memory, our long-term memory, how we learn things through application, how we learn things through varied contexts, that all remains in place. We do need to make education more resilient. We can make better use of technology in education, but we need to do it all in the light of what we know about didactics and pedagogy. So let's just think about language learning for a moment. What is counterintuitive about that? Well, quite a lot, actually. The deeper structures of grammar aren't obvious on the surface. It takes a long time to acquire them, just through induction, through studying the content, the vocabulary and structure of a foreign language. So carefully curated knowledge about grammatical structure introduced into highly practical learning of a second language can really accelerate learning. We know that. It's not obvious that you do that, but we know that that's a feature of high quality programs. And so too, focus on individual learning, but the opportunity to learn through social learning, and for all it to be supported through really good curation of necessary knowledge. both in terms of grammar, vocabulary, of feedback on what's correct and what's incorrect, on application in particular contexts, variation, all of these things we know from empirical studies of high quality language learning should be present in future second language learning. Oh, and things like cultural differences, why language reflects cultural difference, and what you shouldn't say and what you should say when you're engaging in the language of another culture. None of these things are startlingly obvious, and they're best presented through highly structured, well-organized learning programs. So we've taken all of that evidence and from the evidence on transnational comparisons, different subjects, different phases, early years, schooling, continuing education, we've distilled the following principles. Now, you'll hear a lot about how education should change and what it should look like in future. As I said at the outset, lots of people are commenting on future learning. There are lots of groups that are sitting to talk about it. I hope what really characterises ours, the principles that we've put down in the last year, is that they're all underpinned by really secure evidence from high-performing education systems which are committed to both equity and attainment. So 12 principles, and I'll run through them very quickly. So principle 1, early literacy and numeracy are vital foundations for broad and balanced learning. And that applies for general education and for adult learning. If you have insecure literacy, it's extremely difficult to acquire a second language. So you have to look at the foundations of literacy and numeracy for all learners. And many systems have problems at the point of transfer from primary to secondary education, where the kind of difficulties that young people are having with basic literacy and numeracy are not well diagnosed. They then struggle in a range of subjects and become disengaged from learning and pick up bad habits and dispositions in respect of learning. Secondly, curriculum coherence. Now, this comes from the work of Bill Schmidt, and I've refined this into a study of all of the factors which operate within education systems. But Bill's work was really seminal in this area with Richard Prowat. Curriculum coherence, the alignment of curriculum content and standards, teaching practices, learning resources, and assessment. These things should all line up to contribute to equity and attainment. And you can see how easily assessment can become divorced from the principles of your curriculum. Assessment can, for example, narrow the curriculum, or it can not match the content of the curriculum precisely, become invalid. This alignment, curriculum coherence, where everything is contributing appropriately to the learning goals, is absolutely fundamental to high performance. It sounds self-evident and obvious, but actually we see examples of incoherence in many systems. In high-performing systems, we see that the training of teachers, their practices on the ground, the learning materials, the assessment, the content of the curriculum all align. Thirdly, curriculum and its assessment and all other requirements should be a manageable load for all teachers. And we've got around the world many curricula and education programs which present an unmanageable load. They attend to too many things, the curriculum is too full, it's difficult to know what to attend to, and it creates an unmanageable load for educators. Fourthly, effective learning should be built on variety, using well-managed mix of adaptable approaches and modes. Now, there's a lot to this, but this idea of variety is extremely important. James Stigler's work on learning in Japan shows that for a given idea, whether that be in science or in acquisition of a second language, you need to demonstrate it to the learner through a variety of contexts. You can never really tell what context will, as it were, switch on the bulb in a particular learner's head. It may be one context or another. And for sure, seeing a particular example of something, for example in a language, appearing in a range of contexts, really embeds the learning and consolidates it in long-term memory. So a variety of presentations, a variety of problems, a variety of modes, practical activity, quiet thinking time, a use of social learning and individual learning, perhaps digitally supported. That's what we mean by variety. Quite complex, but this idea of variety is important because the human brain actually responds to a variety of presentations of the same idea, Helena Bazzi's work. And the structure and practicalities of what we do need to reflect that. 5, excellence in teaching and elevated attainment can be supported by a well-designed and carefully chosen technology that can support teaching and attainment. That sounds self-evident in the light of pandemic, the use of technology. But there's a key word in there, carefully chosen technology. We have over 250,000 education applications from which teachers and educators can choose. Some of them are of very high quality, and I really commend them. Others are really problematic. I've seen examples where, for example, the adaptive learning means that kids are rooted, and adults are rooted onto particular content. And those decisions are not driven by solid models of learning underneath. So these learners never get to see the more demanding content. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of low expectations. So at the moment, we don't have clear criteria as to how to choose really high quality technology. And this is quite a problem around the world. So carefully chosen technology, harking back to that second principle, curriculum coherence, technology which really supports the underpinning learning model. Good variety in the presentation of particular ideas, good rapid assessment which identifies misconceptions and provides immediate feedback to the learner. Digital applications need to be built on good learning principles and to realize them minute by minute in the way in which they are presented and used. So this is quite tricky. We know that digital is good, but we know that there's variety in the quality. Choosing it is very challenging. And we hope to increasingly support that good choice from the work that we do here in Cambridge. 6, well-trained and well-supported teachers are central to high-quality pedagogy, high attainment, and the well-being of all learners. And this applies to young learners, adolescents, and adults. We can't assume that we just have a world of isolated, highly motivated learners who will engage in learning and just keep going. From continuing education in using really high-quality programs and supported by technology and individuals like the Open University in England, you get high levels of dropout for all sorts of reasons. We've got to be concerned about the structure of motivation of each and every learner. Some are highly intrinsically motivated and are in the circumstances which make it easy to engage in remote learning. Other learners, quite the reverse is true. That they've had bad experiences of learning, their intrinsic motivation may not be that high, and they're in the circumstances which make engagement difficult. They appear and then they disappear from our visibility as professional educators. Now, just because they disappear, we shouldn't be concerned about them. We need to support them in engagement, keep them engaged through individual social learning, support of well-structured programs, highly effective educators, and then equity and attainment for all is a possibility. What we're emphasizing here really is well-trained and well-supported teachers, whether operating in actually alongside people or whether operating remotely, fundamental. 7, evidence and cognitive science should inform teacher practices. And I've already referred to some things in terms of cognitive science, but the work of people like Kurt Fisher would show that you need to commit things to long-term memory. Helena Bazzi's brilliant work on the relationship between short-term memory and long-term memory. In language learning, you have to move things from working memory to long-term memory, and then use approaches like Karpik's work on test-based pedagogy, which really emphasizes constant asking of questions to consolidate the neural pathways between our working memory and our long-term memory. Retrieval practice. So if you need that bit of vocabulary, it's instantly available. And we know more and more and more from cognitive science about the structure of the brain, and more of that explains why some education programs are good and work well. For example, mathematics programs in Singapore and Shanghai, where cognitive science really explains why these programs work, varied practice, immediate feedback on misconceptions. All of this is these long-term practices are now endorsed by more recent cognitive science. So we need to use this evidence from cognitive science as a kind of filter to identify really good practices. And it helps us refine our programs too. 8, access to high quality teaching and learning materials is essential for high quality manageable education at all ages. People have, there's been an anti-textbook ethos in all sorts of countries. Actually, high quality textbooks, well structured, but strongly correspond to high levels of attainment for individuals, for schools and education systems. Of course, we can replicate and build on the high quality that we see in paper-based materials in digital materials. But it's only really in the last decade that there's been widespread systematic analysis of the features of really high quality textbooks, from which we can learn to produce new high quality paper-based materials as well as high quality digital materials. We'll be publishing quite a bit on that soon. 9, dependable assessment is vital for social justice, learning support and equitable progression. There really should be a lot more assessment, a lot more formative assessment, high quality questions which stimulate thinking and produce evidence on attainment, and enable teachers to get a handle on where individuals have grasped something or where they have misconceptions. Very rapid action on those misconceptions, because once they become consolidated, it's a problem. So dependable assessment, vital for equity and attainment in the way in which I've been describing. Lots more formative assessment, which can be accessed by learners flexibly. Teachers have visibility of the outcomes, or there's automated response on correct and incorrect responses. But more than that, learning support linked to incorrect and correct responses. There are some brilliant online programs which don't just pay attention to the correct responses, but pay attention to the incorrect responses. Because inside incorrect responses is knowledge about the learning hurdles and the misconceptions which an individual learner has. And it's addressing those with well-supported materials and next steps which can really ensure that learners remain engaged and attainment and equity are achieved. 10, clear standards are important for equity, accessibility and progression for all learners. The framework of common European standards for language levels, it's a framework of standards. It highlights progression. It enables clarity in terms of the depth of treatment of a particular topic. It communicates what you should learn and to what depth. So standards are not only useful for end assessment to certificate, but also really useful for structuring learning, both the sequence and the content. 11, equity and high attainment can be achieved hand in hand. Eric Hanushek's brilliant work. And that I've emphasized all the way along. That's what we need to achieve for all learners. Not just high attainment for some, but equity and high attainment for all. And then finally, 12, first and second language skills are essential for all learners, including English as the language of international communication, which is present in all of the work which Cambridge University Press and Assessment does in the area of second language. We know how much it unlocks opportunities for individuals globally. So I hope that's helpful. I hope these 12 principles, these evidence-grounded principles, can be seen to be highly valuable in terms of driving towards quality in all phases of education. They're a distillation upon which we can focus, avoiding some of the more controversial and less useful debates about what should be used to improve our education. We've laid them down, we've consulted on them, we've had a lot of positive feedback, and I do hope that running through them today has been helpful. Thank you very much indeed.